Alberta Premier Daniel Smith was in Texas during the Labor Day long weekend, meeting with Governor Greg Abbott. The two were joined by Alberta's trade representatives to the United States, along with officials from Texas. Now, to chat about this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us once again from Edmonton. Tyler, I'm guessing the two groups met to discuss some energy policies?
They sure did. Yeah, they were talking energy policy. Texas, sort of being one of the other major oil and gas producing jurisdictions on the continent, and they talked about some sort of more governance stuff, you might say, like in terms of wildfire management, red tape reduction. Some I guess you might call conservative priorities that sort of across jurisdictional borders and barriers. And Premier Smith said in her sort of tweet explaining what she was doing down there, she said they also had an argument about whether Alberta beef or Texas beef is the superior meat. The Premier, of course, defending the honor of Alberta's ranchers, and Governor Abbott defending the honor of Texas beef producers. So, I guess there's always a little bit of time for fun on the side of these tete-a-tete meetings that politicians tend to have. It's not a lot concrete seems to have come out of this, but then again, it's sort of what concrete might come out of it. But these are sort of relationship building meetings and sharing best practices from jurisdictions that have similar outlooks and goals and things like that. So not an unusual trip in any particular way, but certainly interesting nonetheless.
Gotta say, I'm a big fan of Alberta beef myself. Tyler, Alberta oil production keeps breaking records here, and according to ATB Financial in July, the oil and gas sector produced about 4 million barrels each and every day, breaking previous records and the 9th consecutive July of growth. But, we still have a provincial fuel tax of 13 cents a litre. How does that make any sense?
Well, that has to do with the cost of, or the amount of money that oil producers are getting per barrel of oil. So yeah, production is way up, as you said, sort of breaking records, 9th consecutive year of growth. But that doesn't mean that the price per barrel is all that high. Now, it's not as bad as the government had feared. I believe when they did their budget projections back in January, they're sort of hedging and thinking about $70, $75 a barrel. And I think it's averaged closer to 80 over the last several months. But the way the fuel tax things work is it comes off in portions. So it's a 13-cent tax. I think if it gets over $90 a barrel, the tax comes off by 5 or 6 cents, and then it vanishes basically, I think, at $100 a barrel. So we're still sort of below that threshold, even though it's certainly not nearly as bad as it was, say, back in 2019, when if I recall correctly, I think barrels were selling at like negative prices, which was a fiscal disaster for the Alberta government. But not perhaps as high as the government would want in terms of bringing money into its treasury, and certainly not high enough, I guess, to have a reduction in the fuel tax. So that's, I guess, the explanation there. And I mean, the other thing that is always interesting when you look at oil prices and barrels per day and things like that is, to what extent are other sectors of the economy feeling the benefits of that? Where is that money sort of trickling down, so to speak? And we think about the affordability crisis and all of that. It does, I think, if you were to talk to, regular folks out on the street, it does. And you say, oh, look, we're doing record-breaking oil production. And people are saying, well, it doesn't really feel like it to me. So there's always a little bit of a disconnect, I think, between what regular Albertans are feeling, perhaps, and what big business is posting on these things.
And Tyler, Finance Minister Nate Horner offered up a fiscal update for our province. Alberta is now forecasting a $2.9 billion surplus, which is a lot more than the $367 million surplus that was originally forecasted.
Yeah, so that's good news. About $2.5 billion of that $2.9 billion is actually because of resource revenues being higher than they had originally projected. So that $80 a barrel number is a good thing in some ways, but you can imagine what it might be if it was $95 a barrel or something like that. Now, the thing that is a bit confusing about this is that this is a paper surplus, is what they're calling it. So what this basically means is that there is this money coming in, this surplus money that is going to be there, but it's not like accessible money. It's interest on the Heritage Savings Trust Fund, it's tuition fees going towards things, sort of stuff like that, and obviously the oil revenues as well. But the government is actually still borrowing. They're still borrowing about $600 million this year for sort of short and medium term operational costs. So it's it is admittedly really confusing. And I mean, I'm no economist, so I don't totally understand how it works, but the reality is that that surplus exists, but it's not really money that we can use to spend on hospitals or teachers or something like that, which, is basically the case the NDP is making. They're saying, well, look, if the surplus keeps growing and this money isn't being spent on services for Albertans, well, how good of fiscal management is really being done by the provincial government here? So, certainly not that a good opposition lets any government announcement go by unchallenged, but certainly a little bit of stink being made by the NDP over this last week.
And I believe Premier Daniel Smith also talked about some of that surplus actually going towards our debt as well. So paying down the debt, which is very important for Albertans, all Albertans here. Tyler, some controversy involving our healthcare sector. There's apparently going to be a shift from AHS to Covenant Health, the Catholic healthcare provider. And the noise seems to stem from what healthcare services Covenant really offers compared to Alberta Health Services.
Yeah, so the gist of it is this. Premier Daniel Smith has been doing this sort of tour of the province, holding town hall meetings with UCP party loyalists, which is fine and good. But the interesting thing is that she keeps sort of making policy announcements at these sort of events. And one of the things that she's mused about is sort of trying to introduce some sort of competition into the healthcare system. And the idea is that if Alberta Health Services operates a hospital somewhere, if wait times are too long, if they're not meeting whatever metrics the government sets, well, the government could say, well, sorry, guys, Covenant Health is actually going to step in and run this, and maybe they can do a better job. So you basically have a duopoly in Alberta. You have Covenant Health and you have Alberta Health Services running hospitals. And the idea is basically to have some sort of competition. And the Premier said, well, look, Covenant Health has actually never closed a rural healthcare facility, so perhaps they do it better than Alberta Health Services does. Some critics have pointed out, well, just because they haven't closed any of the facilities they operate doesn't mean they would have any better luck in some of the more challenging parts of the province. So that's been controversial as just an idea in itself. What sort of costs would this be to shift over if that comes up? Would doctors working in those facilities want to continue working for Covenant Health? There's all sorts of other questions here. And you did mention the healthcare procedure thing as well. Obviously, Covenant Health follows Catholic doctrine on medical procedures to some extent. They're, obviously they still provide, say, birth control would be a good example. But they don't, for example, perform assisted suicide in Covenant Health facilities. So there's a little bit of difference basically between what Covenant Health might do and what Alberta Health Services might do. And that's certainly raised some concerns among some parts of the population who are concerned about women's health in particular. So as with anything with the healthcare system, it's never not going to be controversial. And this is sort of one of those proposals that people have latched onto. It is still summer, so anything for a headline really. But some interesting stuff in the works, it seems, on healthcare in the province.
And still on the topic of healthcare, our province, Tyler, has seen a drop in opioid-related deaths. Sadly, 72 people still died of an opioid overdose back in May. But that, however, is the lowest number since the COVID-19 pandemic and a 55% decrease from May of last year.
Yeah, some really encouraging numbers, actually. Still tragic, as you say, but trending in a positive direction. I don't have the exact numbers off the top of my head, but I think in sort of the first 4 or 5 months of 2023, there was something like 700 opioid deaths. And in 2024, it's been more like 350 or 400. So a quite substantial reduction in the number of tragic opioid overdose deaths. Now, part of the question here, as is always the case in these things, is what is responsible for this trend? Is it government policy? Is it just simply changes in the composition of the illegal drug market, things like that? And it's probably a sort of a multifactorial explanation. There do seem to be more people who are on opioid agonist treatment, which is sort of your Suboxone sort of treatments that people can go on, different than a safe supply, but sort of another harm reduction technique, let's say. And there does seem to have been a reduction in carfentanil, the sort of super powerful synthetic opioid that was responsible for a lot of the opioid deaths in the last couple of years. So trending in a positive direction. Obviously, these are May numbers. We don't know what June, July, August looked like yet. There's a lag in this reporting. So we will see if that trend is sustained in the next couple months when new numbers are revealed.
A new provincial health agency launched on September the 1st. It's called Recovery Alberta. Tyler, its focus is specifically on addictions and mental health. Now, this is part of the broader 4-pillar healthcare reorganization?
Yeah, so some months ago, the government announced that they were going to sort of reorganize the way healthcare in Alberta was delivered. Alberta Health Services was going to become more of just a hospital provider, for example, and that was sort of the big one that everyone paid attention to. And Recovery Alberta was really the other big one. And the purpose behind this was saying, this recovery and addictions and mental health has always been sort of a component of the overall healthcare sort of rubric, but it was not given its own sort of system, its own set of bureaucrats, its own set of employees, et cetera, et cetera. And so the idea is that if you create this pillar of the healthcare system that focuses exclusively on that, you might get better management of some of these issues. And, it ties directly into the stuff we were just talking about. Recovery Alberta, I think, will operate it's about 1,500 psychiatric beds and about 1,500 addiction recovery beds. I think there's about 10,000 people who are in that sort of bureaucratic office, I guess, now at this point. Everyone who works in addictions and mental health is a provincial employee. So it's what effect is that going to have? Well, I think we will need to wait and see. Part of the concern about this reorganization was that it was going to actually silo places more. It's perhaps a fine line between creating silos and inspiring focus in parts of the bureaucracy. So I think we'll wait and see, but certainly this is an indication that the Alberta government is taking the addictions and recovery sort of stuff very, very seriously. Regardless, I mean, obviously there's debate over their political and ideological approach to these things, but nobody would dispute that they're taking it very, very seriously, whether or not they agree with the strategy.
Tyler, we have a couple of nomination races going on here in Lethbridge and the Lethbridge West constituency. The three nominees hoping to become the candidate for the UCP are Erin Leclerc. She used to run the constituency office for MLA and current Minister Nathan Neudorf, Lethbridge City Councillor John Middleton Hope, and Shauna Grunninger, who's a real estate agent. When will the constituency vote actually be taking place?
Yeah, it'll be about a few weeks from now. September 23rd is the day that the UCP Constituency Association will make their pick. And it's actually later this week that the NDP will make the choice. On September 7th, the New Democrats down there will choose between Rob Miyashiro and Bridget Mearns. So we will have, one party's person in the next few days here, and the other party will follow suit shortly. What we don't have yet is a date. We don't have a date for the by-election. Premier Danielle Smith has not called that yet. I believe it needs to be within 6 months of the resignation. And if I recall correctly, Shannon Phillips resigned July 1st. So it'll have to be before Christmas, I think. But certainly sometime in this fall is when I would expect that to happen.
And where does Shannon Phillips is working now as an adjunct professor at the U of L. So that's good for her. Now, we always talk about provincial politics. Tyler, let's talk a bit about federal politics now. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau appointed Kim Wells to the Senate. Wells is well known as an academic and someone who studies LGBTQ2+ issues and is apparently a very staunch critic of the UCP's new pronoun policy.
Yeah, that's right. Very staunch critic. One of the folks that people in the media tend to go to for quotes and criticism and things like that on this file, and he's been a part of this debate for a very, very long time. Now, part of the issue that really has come up in the political world is, of course, senators have political views on various provincial government policies or federal government policies or what have you. But the issue here is that Alberta likes to think that it elects its senators. And to some extent, that's true. We do have elections for vacant Senate seats in conjunction usually with a municipal election. And so there were, I believe, a couple people in the last municipal election who were elected by whatever percentage of Albertans ticked the box to be Alberta's next senators. Now, the Prime Minister can choose to pick those people or can choose to ignore those people. In this case, the Prime Minister chose to ignore those people and appointed folks that he wanted. Some conservative prime ministers, though, have actually taken to heart the votes that Albertans have cast in these things. So there's a little bit of controversy there with Alberta's government saying, look, well, we Albertans voted on this thing, and neither of these folks ran for it and certainly didn't win. So a little bit of a jurisdictional squabble there. But, for the last 10 years, this has been the way of it. The federal Liberal government has not been appointing the folks that Albertans have elected.
Tyler, we've all seen the makeshift memorial set up at the Saddledome in Calgary for former Flame Johnny Gaudreau and his brother Matthew. A vigil honoring the two will take place this evening. Sadly, the two passed away last week after a suspected drunk driver hit them both while they were cycling in their home state of New Jersey.
Yeah, so the event will be at the Saddle Dome, I believe, and Candlelight Vigil, I think, is what they're calling it. Huge outpouring of support for the family in the last week. It's been really quite remarkable to see. And on the maybe policy side of this, almost, I think it really has sparked a discussion, certainly around dinner tables and coffee tables and stuff like that, about road safety and cyclist safety and the way people are behaving on the roads. I mean, I think that's been a really running part of the discussion this summer that I've seen is just the state of driving on the roads and things like that. Of course, there was that tragic incident out in High Prairie over the weekend as well, when a semi-truck hit a group of motorcycle riders. So there's this, there's the tragedy and there's the mourning and the grieving that's happening right now. But I do get the sense that at some point this is going to shift towards a conversation of, well, how do we stop this sort of thing from ever happening again? Does there need to be more driver education? Do people need to be more aware of cyclists? Things like that. So it's maybe too early to say something positive is going to come out of this tragedy, but it does seem like this discussion is slowly growing in wake of this tragedy.
And what's sad, even to this day in the 21st century, people still drink and drive. That's what I still can't fathom. It's just unbelievable. He's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Thanks so much for joining us today from Edmonton.
Always a pleasure, Hal.